Hi everyone. Here we are with our third lecture. Our focus today is going to be life in the High Middle Ages. Chronologically, the High Middle Ages go from about 1000 AD to about 1250 AD. And things finally for the people of the Middle Ages began to get a little better and go in a new direction. Okay, just a reminder, what I want you to do is choose 3 of the terms, which I'm going to mention in just a second. So choose 3 of these terms, and for each of these 3 terms, write a 1-paragraph examination of the term in relation to the overall lecture, the meaning of the overall lecture. And in addition, I want you to do a 1-paragraph response post to any of the terms which your fellow classmates mentioned there in the discussion board. Thanks. Okay, our terms are going to be, first term, feudalism, Feudalism. Second term, fief, Fief, or manor. Third term, serf, Serf. Fourth term, vassal, Vassal. Next term, lord. The term after that is overlord. Next term is oath of fealty, Felty. The next term, system of primogeniture, and that's spelled Primogenniture. Our next term is High Middle Ages. Next term, Cluniard, Cluniard, monk. Next term, Cistercian, Sistercian, monk. Next term, choir, monk. Next term, lay, monk. Our next term is the social classes of the Middle Ages. Next term, lifestyle of each class in the Middle Ages, semicolon, serf peasant, comma, monk priest, comma, knight. Next term, purgatory. Next term, indulgences. Okay, so let's talk about this new political structure that starts during the High Middle Ages. All right, around the year 1000 AD, basically we're going to see the start of a new type of political structure. Okay, here's how the structure worked. All right, basically there were all these the whole idea of the Carolingian dynasty essentially fell apart, and instead there's going to be these kind of very strong warriors that are controlling these different areas of Western Europe. Each of these areas had these really strong dominant leaders. These strong dominant leaders are going to be called overlords, our first term. So overlord means a strong dominant leader, and it's part of the next term, feudal system. So feudal system or feudalism is this new system of government that is part of the High Middle Ages. So existing from about 1000 till about 1250 AD. So at the top of this new system is going to be the overlord. But the overlords had a whole bunch of land, more land than they really needed. Instead, they wanted people to basically run the land for them and be there when they called them. So these people who were there when they called them, they're going to be referred to as lords, our next term. So a lord, as suggested in the name, is under an overlord. A lord is actually what they call a vassal, our next term, V-A-S-S-A-L. A vassal means you're beneath someone, but you have a sense of allegiance to them. So you're subservient to them. So the lord is subservient to the overlord. You know, why the overlord gives the lord some land. The land that the overlord gives to the lord is going to be called a fief or a manor, our next term. So a fief or a manor is the land that a lord gets from an overlord. He gets this land from his overlord through a ceremony where he takes on what's called, our next term, an oath of fealty. F-E-L-T-Y. Fealty means fidelity or honor. So during this oath of fealty, the lord becomes the vassal of the overlord. It means that he's at the beck and call of his overlord. So the overlord gives the lord some land after he takes on this oath of fealty, and that means he's there when the overlord wants him. So if the overlord wants to do a battle with another overlord, he's going to command the lord to be there. And since the lord took on this oath of fealty, he'll always be there. So it's based on a system of honor. Okay, so the lord is going to get some of this land of the overlord, and there on the land, the lord is going to build a castle and also have land. The castle and the land is going to basically be there where he lives. And on this land where he lives, he's going to have what are called serfs, S-E-R-F. So a serf, another term, serf, is going to be there at the beck and call of his lord, of the lord of the manor. So the serf lives on part of the manor, and the serf is going to be there working the manor that is owned by the lord. And the lord is getting this land from the overlord. And the place where the overlord, the place where the lord lives is going to be called a manor or a fief. So a manor or fief, F-I-E-F, our next term, so a manor or fief is going to be, the land where the lord lives and where the serfs are going to be working. Now, the term serf, S-E-R-F, it basically it means to serve. So the serf is going to serve his lord because he gets that land to live. Just like the lord serves the overlord because he gets that land from the overlord. But the serf does not take on the oath of fealty, whereas the lord does take an oath of fealty to the overlord in order to become the overlord's vassal. So it's really only the upper class, or the lords and the overlords, where the system is based on fealty or honor. Okay, so now what we see is there's going to be a way to pass on land to your children. Well, the only one who really gets anything is going to be the first son. The reason why the first son gets it is because the feudal system is based on, our next term, a system of primogeniture. So under this system of primogeniture, P-R-I-M-O-G-E-N-I-T-U-R-E, under the system of primogeniture, the first son inherits everything. So basically, the second son, the third son, any of the daughters get nothing. Everything goes to the first son. So those of you who are the first son, you're probably going to like that system. Those of you who are not wouldn't be too thrilled. Okay, let's talk about what life was like during the High Middle Ages. So our next term is the High Middle Ages, and the High Middle Ages was in many ways a much better life than the early Middle Ages. Remember, we talked about that whole period of the 8th and 9th century, where 100 years, almost all of them were fought fighting. Well, the High Middle Ages, things get better. Because of this feudal system, everyone kind of knows their place. The serf works the land owned by the lord. The lord takes on this oath of fealty and becomes the vassal of the overlord, and there's not too much fighting going on. Well, or at least not as much as before. Now, what makes it a bit better is that the climate gets a little better. Now, a few degrees difference is going to make a whole lot of difference in what can be grown and whether people are going to be hungry or not. So they are also going to come up with certain inventions during the High Middle Ages, which make life in the High Middle Ages more pleasant. For example, during the High Middle Ages, there's going to be the invention of what's called the three-field system. The three-field system is actually a really good idea. What it's based on is in agriculture, it's the idea that you use up only 2 of the fields, and the third field in the three-field system is left fallow, so it's kind of just left to regenerate. So that way none of them get overused because they're constantly changing which of the 3 is left unused. So that allows for them to grow more crops and better crops. There's also going to be various inventions. For example, they start using mills. So windmills and water mills. So this makes it much less labor intensive and makes their life more pleasant. And that way serfs can be working on other farming things rather than, other things like they did before. So that makes it a bit easier. Now there's also going to be the invention of the plow. Now it's interesting what happens with the plow. The plow is actually originally going to be pulled by serfs. So when it's invented in, I believe it was the 12th century, initially what happens is serfs pull the plow rather than horses. Why? Because horses have horseshoes, and horses eat a whole lot, so you don't want to waste the energy of the horse. It's just cheaper to have the serfs pull the plow. So, think what that'd be like. The horse is watching the people pull the plow. Definitely a very strange image for probably most of us to contemplate. Now, by the middle of the High Middle Ages, approximately a third of all manors, and these manors are of different size, some are much bigger than others, a third of all manors are going to have their own mills. Now, at the same time, there's also going to be a religious revival during the High Middle Ages. So they start forming new kinds of monastic orders. They become more interested in monastic orders, and they develop new types of monastic orders. So different types of monks, beyond the Benedictine monks that we had talked about before. For example, one type of monks that developed during the High Middle Ages is going to be Cluniard monks. Cluniard, Cluniard monks. They start in the 12th century, the middle of the 12th century. They're called Cluniard because they come from Cluny, France. And the head of the Cluniard monks, and indeed the head of any monastery, is going to be referred to as an abbot. So everyone in the monastery, all the different monks, take on an oath of obedience to their abbot. Okay, now what happened was the Cluniard monks start trying to live a more pious life than many of the other monks. Um, William the Conqueror, an English nobleman, basically starts appreciating how much the monks are giving up. You know, they're living apart from everyone. They're spending all their day praying. They're spending all their day um, tidying up the monastery, farming, and they're uh, also one of the big functions of the monks is going to be the fact that the monks are actually copying down the Bible. So it's the monks are the most educated people in medieval society. Priests are not educated. Your average priest is just a serf, a basic farmer, working for a lord, who then becomes the religious leader of the service on the weekend. So a priest is not particularly educated. What the priest started doing was basically making up words as they went along and saying these words were Latin. Since the people were uneducated, they didn't know the difference, and they would just nod their heads and go along. So it'd be like me saying a bunch of gibberish and saying it's Swahili. Are you going to really know if it is or isn't? It would be me making up words in Swahili and you pretending to know and nodding your head. Well, obviously, nobody's going to get a whole lot of, knowledge that way. So where's the real knowledge in the Middle Ages? Who are the real, academics or intellectuals in the Middle Ages? Well, it's going to be the monks, and the monks are completely in seclusion. So they're copying down the Bible, they're praying by themselves, they're praying in groups, they're keeping up the monasteries. So William the Pious, a lord, decides he wants to start a new type of monastery, and he starts a new type of monastery in Cluny, France, called the Cluniard monks. He's so proud of the fact that the monks are giving up everything that he starts giving them lots of gifts. Because he says, look, you're not around people, you're not having sex, you're not really doing anything other than focusing on God's word. So the least we can do is make your life comfortable. So he starts giving them lots of lavish gifts. Well, what do you think is going to happen to that monastic order? Yes, if you guessed it, the Cluniard monks become the luxury-loving monks of the Middle Ages. So more and more of their time is spent enjoying luxury. They start living the life of medieval lords. So they start living like minor kings. They start dressing in fancy silks and having lots of jewelry, and the liturgy that they start saying, the prayers get more complex and more elaborate, and basically they become centered more and more on the luxury rather than the simplicity of the word. And, when you think about it, Christ and his disciples, they were the polar opposite. They were a very simple life, a carpenter, a fisherman. The Cluniard monks are living more like kings. So they basically become very spoiled. They eat rich food. They drink a lot. They basically are becoming, more and more hedonistic. It's almost like, what's going to happen if, you give your kid a car without making them have any stake in the upkeep of it. Like, let's say, you grew up poor, but then you start a business and you do well, and you want, your kid to live a better life than you do. And, this is a natural thing. I would say probably any good parent would want their children to live a better life than them. So you say, hey, I have the money. I'm going to, buy my kid a sports car at 16. Is the kid really going to appreciate it if he doesn't work for the gas, the insurance, some kind of part of the upkeep? Probably not. He's just going to become entitled and take it for granted. So that's kind of what happens with the Cluniard monks. They become spoiled and lazy and just concentrating more and more on gifts rather than the Word of God. So, what are we going to see? In reaction to the Cluniard monks, we're going to see a new type of monastic order. The new type of monastic order is going to be what's called our next term, Cistercian monks. Cistercian. Cistercian monks are the most austere type of monks. They live the harshest life. They're almost kind of like we were talking about. Remember, before the break, we were talking about the Stoics. The Stoics are all about serving others, doing without, and the Epicureans were all about luxury. Well, the Cistercians become like the Stoics. They live a very harsh life, spending their whole time praying and chanting and just living a very simple, basic existence, more like that of Christ and the disciples. They say we can live more like Christ and understand what Christ was going through and what Christ was saying if our life is more like his. So they're going to be largely in reaction to the overhedonism of the Cluniard monks. So the two are polar opposite, the luxury-loving Cluniards and the real austere Cistercians. And what's interesting is their services also become much more simple and, back to basic. Okay, now what else are you going to see here in the High Middle Ages in terms of the monastery? Well, with the Cluniard monks, with this focus on luxury and leisure and pleasure, so kind of like the Epicureans, what the Cluniard monks start doing is they're going to say, hey, with all this money, we really don't want to have to do the upkeep of the monastery. We'd rather have somebody else do it, but the only one who's allowed in a monastery is going to be a monk. So what do? They start hiring serfs to, work their in the monastery, and then they give them this title of our next term, lay monk. So a lay monk would be someone who's not really a monk, not living like a monk, but is basically doing the dirty work there in the monastery. So they're like the servants who work in the monastery. They cook the food, they clean the building, they do the farming to grow food outside the monastery. So the lay monks are essentially the janitors of the monastery. But for a serf, this is seen as the highest level that they could come. It was seen as like a prime job, that they've reached their ultimate potential, because they're not just a serf working in the fields of owned by a lord, but they're closer to God because now they're doing the same kind of work there for the monks, or at least the Cluniard monks. So that would be the lay monks. Now there's also going to be what are called choir monks. Our next term is choir monks. And what choir monks are, as suggested in the name, the choir monks are the ones who do all the chanting. They're going to come up with these various chants. They're going to be chanting prayers. They're going to be singing. So they're made as a kind of the opposite of the lay monks. So they're going to be the ones, not just among the Cluniard monks, but all the different monastic orders are going to have their own choir monks. Be basically the people with the best voice who do most of the singing rather than the silent contemplation. So if you had a choice, what would you want to be? A Cluniard monk, a Cistercian monk, a lay monk, or a choir monk? Okay. Our next term is going to be looking at the social classes of the High Middle Ages. So by the High Middle Ages, there's a firmly defined class system. And we're going to be talking about these three classes. The three social classes of the High Middle Ages are, there's going to be serfs and peasants, who are the majority of the population. I'm going to talk in a minute about what their life was like. They make up the majority of the people. Most of us probably would have been of that class if we lived during that time. So a commoner. And notice in that term serf, serf means to serve others. So you serve the lord of the manor and you live there on the manor. You also had to ask the Lord's permission to leave the manor and also ask the Lord's permission to get married. So you were almost like a slave, but you could not be bought and sold. So we have the serfs and peasants. So they would be the lower class or the average person. Okay, what's the difference between a serf and a peasant? Well, basically a peasant was a free individual who did not live on the manor. Most peasants decided to become serfs. They would become serfs because they were worried about being kidnapped. There's no police system in the High Middle Ages. There's no one to protect you. So what was happening is the Muslims were coming and kidnapping people and making them their slaves and taking them away. There's no one you could call for protection. So in order to get protection, what a peasant would do, they would turn their land over to the lord of the manor, and the lord of the manor would now protect them. Because he was trained with swords and had the ability to protect people. So in order not to be kidnapped by Vikings or by the Muslims, the majority of freestanding peasants basically instead became serfs, but it was their choice. And there were still a few freestanding serfs, but it was at your own risk. Okay, so that's one class, the serfs and peasants. We also have the class of people who pray. The class of people who pray are going to be the monks and the priests. Now, we talked a little bit about the difference. There's all these different monastic orders. Monks are always in seclusion, away from people, and monks are always a whole lot more educated than priests. Priests are just regular serfs or peasants who become religious leaders on the weekends and make up things as they go along. And then the people just follow along and say, basically they're agreeing. So the higher ups in the church hierarchy, the Monsignor, the bishop, the archbishop, the cardinals, they knew a whole lot. But, your average parish priest was really highly uneducated. One of the ways that people learned was by looking at stained glass windows. Stained glass windows were ways of teaching people who could not read stories of the Bible. So almost like you would show a picture book to a child before the child could read or really understand anything. The third class would be the knights. So the knights would be the nobility. They would be the lords and the overlords. So they're going to be the upper class, and they're going to be the third of the classes in there in the Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages, and they're going to be the rarest of the three classes. Okay, now to get a real feel of what life was like for each of these three classes, I now want to describe in some detail the average life of each of these classes. Okay, your average serf was really had a very difficult life. And remember, serfs make up the majority of people in society. They're very dependent on the climate. So fortunately for them, the climate gets much better, as I mentioned, because it gets, 2 or 3 degrees hotter by the time of the High Middle Ages, so they can grow more food. But in other times, it's very common for them to become either nutritionally stressed or even to starve to death. Your average serf never went more than about 5 miles from the place that they were born. There was nowhere to go. They knew no one outside of their small community. So there was a very strong sense of community among the serfs there on the manor. Now, community has its good parts and its bad parts. What would you say some of each are? Well, you get to know the people very well. They know you. But at the same time, if you like the person, it can be a wonderful time. You're together all the time. But what if you don't like them? There's nowhere to escape. There's nowhere to go. And you're stuck there with them forever. So very strong sense of community there among the serfs there on the manor. They're doing very monotonous farm work. So basically, the same kind of boring work every day. It's boring, it's hard. Your average serf family was made up of 5 people. They would have a mother, a father, and 3 children. Rarely grandparents, because they just didn't live that long. The average life expectancy was somewhere, in the 40s at most. About 94% of serfs are going to get married. Both men and women are going to work the fields together. Sometimes women could earn a serf woman could make a little extra money by selling some milk, egg, or cheese that she had. But at the same time, when climates were bad, it wasn't uncommon at all for people to starve to death. Okay, with all that boredom around them, they're also going to be drinking a lot. So they're really drinking an amazing amount. Your average, now, to keep in mind, the water was not safe to drink, so the only way you could make it safe was to distill it. That would, basically destroy all the impurities. And you're working, hard out there on the farm. So what are you doing? Well, you're drinking as much as 3 to 4 gallons of ale a day. So, you're drinking and peeing a whole lot. The most common way to die was by what they call death by ale. So that would include getting so drunk that you fell down somewhere, and then the climate was too cold, you would just freeze to death. It would also include bar fights. You drink too much, you aren't getting along with the people in your manor, and then you get in fights with them, and then a lot of violence, and you die. Some of these big problems there of being a average person or a serf in the Middle Ages. What was their living conditions like? Well, most people lived in tents made of vines wrapped around poles. So imagine how cold that was. You're in northern Germany or something in the winter, and you're trying to stay warm by living in basically a structure made of vines around poles. The houses were made of soil, so no cement, and they usually had a fireplace. That made it a little bit better. Next to the house, you would have sheds where you would keep your farming tools, but you would usually keep your animals, like your horse, there in with you in your home. Now, why? Well, for the same reason you probably would not leave your new iPad out on your step. You'd be worried somebody would steal it. Well, they were worried somebody would steal their horse. Their horse was their livelihood. So you wanted to make sure that, you kept it okay. Now, what you usually did, you would the whole family would sleep together in 1 or 2 beds. It became a way to keep warm. But at the same time, a lot of things that are today private were at that time, very much in view. So the children were definitely not innocent in the way that we expect children to be today. Let's talk about their diet. Their diet's actually kind of interesting. Okay, first of all, it's going to be really heavy on dark black bread made of frequently barley and oats. It's usually baked once a week. In addition, serfs frequently ate cheese. Um, they would occasionally get chicken, but they would have to turn over almost all the chicken and eggs to the lord of the manor, because it was seen as his manor, so the food there belonged to him, and then he would decide how much to give to his serfs. Often it would become a way to reward them if they, worked particularly hard. He would give them a little more food. The only time they really had meat, and the most common meat to eat, was pork. You would only have pork maybe a couple times a year. That would be on Christmas or on the Lord of the Manor's birthday. So notice, not on the serf's birthday, but on the Lord of the Manor's birthday, a way to celebrate. Serfs would frequently have their breakfast before dawn. They would usually have bread, cheese, and ale. Lunch was the main meal of the day for serfs. And what's interesting, this continues today as a European tradition. As Americans, our big meal is usually dinner. The European way is actually smarter, because when do you really need the energy to do a lot of work? You need it at lunchtime to continue working in the afternoon. You don't need it at dinner time to just sit back and read or watch TV. But dinner for them was smaller. Dinner was usually leftover soup from lunch. The soup was frequently like a hearty vegetable stew. And along with the leftover soup, they had more bread, cheese, milk, and ale. So a very monotonous diet, kind of like their monotonous life in general, doing farm work time in, time out. In addition, what made their life very hard was, by the high Middle Ages, it was also more common than not for the first child to die. Okay, so what gave the people of the high Middle Ages any sense of meaning in their life? Well, it's certainly not the diet. It's certainly not the food. What it's going to be for many of them is religion. So religion becomes an important part of their everyday life. The village church becomes the center meeting place of all activities, where they meet to go to church, where they, most of the events in people's lives are centered around church. Even today, that's somewhat the case. Weddings, church. Bar mitzvahs, Jewish church, which is synagogue. Funerals, church. So, churches become, and this continues today, even in, very much in rural areas, people often meet at the church. It becomes kind of the center of all activities. So most people's major events in life centered around the church. For teenagers and young unmarried people who want to express their affection to the person they love, but don't want to be there right in front of their parents and younger siblings, where's the makeout place? Where's the lovers' lanes? It's going to be the church cemetery. Now, what's kind of interesting is, even today, in the South, they frequently call cemeteries churchyards. So now, where you were buried in the churchyard, or indeed under the church, was a strong indication of your social class. The further you are from the altar, the less important you are. So if you were buried real far away, like the end of the cemetery, this showed you were, not very important. Someone more important would be in the middle of the cemetery. If you're a nobleman, you'd be buried under the church. And if you're, someone almost like a saint, someone who did something really special or seemed of having almost magical powers, then you were buried like under the altar. So your burial place was a big indication of your social class, and also an indication of the importance of the church. There's one of the ways that people would learn the Bible, so a big part of religion, would be they would, as I mentioned before, they would learn it from looking at the stained glass windows, but they would also perform what are called miracle plays. Miracle plays were plays that demonstrated and dramatized major events in the Bible. So like you would have Daniel in the lion's den, it would be acted out and shown, so that way the serfs would understand what the story was about. Your average nobleman could read, but your average serf could not. And of course, as I mentioned before, your average priest could not. The parades were often centered around the church and celebrated the achievements of local saints and celebrated important events in the Bible. Everyone really liked parades. The whole town would get involved and everyone you knew would be part of it. So it was a major part of people's lives. They believed very much in the idea that God could become involved in common people's lives. And they're going to say, God did good things for people. God gave people things like health, wealth, peace, and happiness. But at the same time, they were also going to say God punished the wicked. So how did he punish the wicked? He punished them with, he punished sinners with disease, with war, and with poor harvests, which led to starvation. The people were also very worried about the devil. They were constantly felt they were going to hell. It was their biggest fear that one day they would go to hell. The biggest fear they felt was sexual transgressions. Remember, this is long before the age of Freud, when we kind of acknowledge everybody is basically a strongly sexual being. At this time, they have sexual feelings and they feel great sense of guilt about it. You desire someone other than the person you're married to, or you desire someone before you get married, that's completely forbidden. They're going to say that must be the devil tempting you. They believe the devil came out at night, so they felt, people want sex or engage in sex more at night. So that must be the devil whispering in your ear, trying to lead you into some kind of sexual transgression. People of the High Middle Ages are very primitive. They believe they feared greatly nature. They feared storms. They feared thunder. They feared lightning. They all felt these were manifestations or indications of hell. They believed that there were ghosts that could haunt you. So they were, very childlike and primitive in their religious beliefs. Eventually what's going to happen during the High Middle Ages, they're going to come up with the idea of what's called our next term, purgatory. Purgatory. Another word for purgatory is limbo. Limbo or purgatory, or a state of limbo, is when you die and you're not good enough to go to heaven, but not bad enough to go down into hell. So you're in this state of waiting, or the state of limbo there in purgatory. So, for example, they believed in the Middle Ages that anyone born before Christ, since they couldn't accept Christ as their savior, they believed that people like Aristotle and Plato were instead in limbo, in purgatory, and would have to stay there. They hadn't done anything wrong that necessarily would put them in hell, but they hadn't accepted Jesus as their savior because Jesus wasn't born yet. So they believed instead that people were in purgatory. Now, they also started coming up with, during the High Middle Ages, the churches came up with the idea of what's called, our next term, indulgences. Indulgences are a way that you could buy forgiveness for your sins. So people would spend money, they would give money to the church, so doing a good deed, and the church would give them forgiveness, so that way they wouldn't, go to hell. So let's say, you have a lustful eye and there's this person you're attracted to, and it's not your wife. Well, one way you could prevent going to hell is you would ask the priest, to sell you an indulgence, and the church would sell you an indulgence, and this you could indulge yourself as a way of getting into heaven. Now, how these indulgences originally started were a way for knights who were involved in the Crusades so that they could go and fight in the Holy Land against the Muslims, make sure that they, who didn't have time to go to church, that they would still go to heaven. But then the church realized this was a good moneymaker, and they started selling these indulgences to regular people as a moneymaker, and that way people could indulge themselves.